Hello dear students, myself Manish Joshi, and in the lecture series of distributed system, today I am going to deliver on Remote Method Invocation RMI. In this lecture we will cover the following topics: Introduction to Java RMI, Characteristics of Java RMI, Working Mechanism of RMI, and Future of RMI. First of all, we should know that what is Java RMI. Here we are saying that it is Java RMI because RMI coding is to be performed in a Java language. Basically, RMI is a true distributed computing application interface for Java because its coding is to be written in a Java language. It is written to provide easy access to objects existing on remote virtual machines. It helps to provide access to objects existing on remote virtual machine. So RMI is a method through which we can invoke the methods from a remote objects and execute it on another system, another remote system, or we can say that we can invoke the methods from a client and we can execute it on a remote server. So in this case, Java RMI treats remote objects similarly to local objects. So as we are communicating through the remote objects in this case, so while communication it will be treated as a local object. Now certain characteristics of Java RMI is that it can handle the marshalling tasks, in which means wrapping up of all the parameter in a container, transportation through the protocols, and garbage collection of the remote objects. It is a part of a JDK package as it is using the Java programming. So now RMI is also a part of JDK package. It is language dependent. It is only used with the Java. Interface to remote object are defined using ordinary Java interface. As we are using a general Java programming, the same type of interfaces are being used in our RMI system. Can provide more advanced features like serialization, security. So maintaining the proper scheduling of message communication in between client and the server. So it is using the security, and for the proper authentication from both the ends, it is using the security features. Now we are moving on to the working mechanism of RMI. Working mechanism of RMI is initiated as soon as an application, a method can be invoking a request from client to the server. So here we have a client, and we are saying that in this scenario we have a particular client. So client, we are accessing a request. Here we have a stub. Now stub is a remote object. Using this remote object, the request can be accessed to the server. Now as soon as a request to be transmitted through the server medium, it will handle that particular request, and that particular request to be transmitted by means of a remote reference layer. Now remote reference layer make the proper interaction between a particular client and a server. Now as soon as these instructions of a request are being processed through the remote reference layer, these are being transported through a networking medium. Here we have a transportation unit. It will be networked through another transportation medium. Now as soon as these instructions or requests are to be retrieved at the server end, these methods are to be accessed through another object that is called a skeleton. So in this case, skeleton will invoke the methods as well as parameters from the client and going to execute it. Finally, these are executed at the server, and these are again returned back to the client. So that mechanism is going on. First of all, through an application, client make a request through the remote object stub. These are to be processed through remote reference layer. Remote reference layer transported particular request at the server end. As soon as it is retrieved at the server end, it will to be communicated through another object that is called a skeleton. Skeleton take the parameter and take the method from the client and execute, and again the results of that particular schema is to be returned again to the client. Now certain interfaces are being supported in this RMI structure. First of all is the stub skeleton layer, stub at the client end and skeleton at the server end. Now this layer is responsible for managing the remote object interface between client and the server. So for maintaining the proper interface between client and the server remote interface, we are using the stub skeleton layer. Now remote reference layer, as soon as the stub task to be getting, we are moving on to the remote reference layer, that is managing the liveliness of the remote object. As the application to be lively, it means the real-time application, real-time interaction between client and the server. For this we are using the remote reference layer. It will managing the communication between client server and virtual machine, so that the proper communication may be ensured in between client and the server. For this we are using the remote reference layer. It will ensures that the liveliness between client and server, so that the live communication may be permitted. Now we have a transport layer. Any communication between client and the server to be made through the transportation layer through certain protocols. For example, we are using transmission control protocol, internet protocol in between client and the server. Also it is uses serialization for the for scheduling purposes, for scheduling of different messages transmitted, and remote processor call to send information back and forth between remote objects, because as soon as the result are being generated through the server, these are again retrieved at the client end. So for this they may use the RPC also. Now interface support layer in RMI, we have a transport layer used as a hierarchy. Now what the transport layer will does, first of all, its intention is to make a connection between client and the server through the local sockets, ordinary sockets. Now if the connection is not to be established through the ordinary socket, it moving on to HTTP, it means hypertext transfer protocol. At HTTP it will try to use a CGI script on the server and post the data. Generally post method data will be used from client to the server for transmission of data. Now how the interface to be created, first step is creating the interface. So first of all, interface will define what remote methods and variables are going to be exported from the remote objects. So whatever the methods and parameters are being exported from client to the server, in between this mechanism we have a path, we have a medium, that is called interface. So interface is required in between client and the server. It must be adhered to the certain limitation. That interface must be public so that it can be easily accessible. It must import the Java package, java.rmi.strict package, java.rmi.remote interface, and Java, and its exceptions are being through the RMI remote exceptions. And all the references to remote object must be references to the interface. It means all the references to a remote object must be references to the interface. It means the number of references to a remote object is also being references to the interface, not to remote object itself. Now as soon as the interface to be created, we are moving on to implement it. For implementation, whenever we are moving on to implementation, we have a certain limitations, like it must implement at least one remote interface, to be maintained between client and the server. It must import the java.rmi.server.star package. It must extend java.rmi.server.unicast remote object. These packages are required so that the proper communication may be established. It must install a security manager for proper authentication. Must create at least one instance of a remote object, instance of a remote object to be created. Must register at least one of the remote object with the RMI remote object registry. So RMI remote object registry, at least one of the remote object to be executed. Now process, what the processing methods will be there. First one is creating the stub skeleton. How the stub skeleton to be created. Now stub skeleton code generated by using the RMIC compiler. So the code at the stub object or the skeleton object, these are generated using RMIC compiler. RMIC compiler create stub and skeleton classes. First of all, two classes are to be created. First is a stub, second is a skeleton classes. Stub and skull classes are where the references to the remote object will resolve in the client's address space. So for these classes we are generating a remote objects that will be resolved at the client address space. Now RRL, what does? RRL will manage the mapping of these objects at the server address space. So these remote objects are to be mapped at the server on its address space. Next, at the client end, what should be ensured? We should be imported java.rmi.package and java.rmi.rmi security manager. This package for proper transmission of messages, proper interaction between client and the server, and this package to maintain the proper authenticity or maintain the proper authentication parameters between client and the server. Client must register with the security manager. So what the security manager will does, as we are working with the Java programming, so proper web interaction, we are using the Java applet. So Java applet are residing at the sandbox. So sandbox, it will maintain the security manager. Loading of classes loading from the network cannot be trusted, because we are working with the remote object. So the classes loaded from the network cannot be trusted. So for this we must need the authenticity or security in between them. If new security manager exists, only classes from the local file system will be loaded. If we have no security manager to be installed, we cannot make the proper interaction between remote computer system. Now after registering the security manager, we must have moving on to the RMI registry. So in RMI registry, we are maintaining at the client end. It must have two components. First is a server name and second is a RMI remote object name. So here my server is a server name, and using this my server is a remote object, and so using this my server, we are maintaining the proper interaction. It enables the client to look up the remote object on the server via the RMI registry. So what the server will does, so it will look up the RMI registry at the client end, and through this RMI registry it will be invoking the objects. So once the remote reference is made, client can invoke remote methods on the remote object. It can easily invoke those remote methods. The remote object is then treated as it were a local object. As soon as the result are to be generated, the remote object are treated as a local ones. Now at the server end, we have a same type of packages are to be there as we are installing at the client end regarding its working and the security. Once the server has registered with the security manager, it must create an instance of remote object you want to export. So as soon as the packages are being installed, it must create an instance of the remote object it want to export. Now what the RMI registry will do, it must RMI registry, whatever the registry to be created, the client end must be runnable on the server. The object registered, so this should be workable. Clients are given access to remote objects, so this client must have proper access to remote objects through the RMI medium. Since the server using the RMI registry, we must bind an instance of the object with the name that will be used to look up the object. So whatever the object we are using, that must have at least one instance that we have to bind for the proper communication in between client and a server. Now till now we are discussing about the mechanism of RMI. Now the future scope for RMI, now it's being a part of JDK package. According to Sun, RMI has not been replaced by Core by IOP because these are two different mechanisms. But as according to JavaSoft, RMI may be extended in the future also, so that the IOP is working as a transport protocol. So these are the some advancement of RMI, but still RMI is a reliable medium to make a remote call of methods from client to the server. So in this lecture we discuss about the introduction of RMI, its characteristics, its working mechanism, and the future of RMI. Hope you understood well. Thanks for joining us. Thanks a lot.